The memory of the airstrip was now only a part of the mist. A last fleeting glance of a battle zone, potted with holes, craters, lives. Haggard tried to forget. He was flying solo, this time, defending his country. Diplomatic failure, surprise attack, and now retaliation. Haggard hadn't had any sleep, and now he couldn't. Flying low and fast, alone. A David against a bastard Goliath, a Goliath so big that he didn't stand a chance, alone. But he had his orders. He flew on, feeling the vibration of the engine, drifting above green and brown patches, the horizon, the sky, black clouds ahead, and exhaustion. He drifted into a conscious stream. He tasted cold, sharp metal while his mouth was dry and empty. He felt his head tied, bound in a heavy casing that blocked his eyes. He reached for his hands and couldn't feel, they wouldn't move. Somehow his feet were different, but exactly how, he couldn't tell. He tried to curl his toes and found his heels curling with them. He twitched his head and felt for his arms. They weren't the same. They felt like long, ragged stumps, useless pieces of a defenseless monster. He tried to scream, tried to fight his way out of the nightmare, but the high-pitched shrill of his own voice made him stop. "Relax. I'm here," a distorted voice whispered. He knew the voice. It was his son, Warren. A hand brushed down his chest, pushing on the padding over his flesh. He felt each touch, each caress soothe over the sensitive shafts in his skin. He opened his mouth, but closed it, knowing that it too had changed. Every part of him had changed. Haggard shook himself from the dream and again looked upon the approaching clouds. How could he dream with open eyes, with the thrust of the engine, the vibration surrounding him? He could die in an instant. That was nothing new. There was always a risk, but to cross a border, to fly low. He thought of his wife and his son. She hated the waiting, the silence. He then wondered if they were someplace safe during this war. He shook his head again, realizing that his country wouldn't call it a war. How could they against something as big as the sun? Something that shined its light upon them so much there was no shade left. Haggard grinned and let his vision fade away. He stood, hooded and hungry, straining to hear the footsteps as they neared him. Each step sent a quiver through the ground, shaking his perch, sending a tremor of fear through his neck, back, and down the tips of his wings. He cringed at the smell of man, and stumbled as a gloved hand slipped under his legs. He stepped onto the hand, tried to hold on, and spread out his wings to maintain his balance. "Sorry," Warren said. "I shouldn't move too fast." Haggard smelled dried blood and felt meat touch his beak. "Will you eat now?" Haggard wanted to gorge on the old dried flesh. He wanted to rip and claw at every bit of the carcass. He wanted to tear at the living, wet game and feel it squirm under the weight of his claw. But he wouldn't touch what was offered. He'd lost his freedom to fly. After a moment he turned his head away and was thankful it wasn't fresh. He might have taken it. Warren lifted his arm and lowered it in a circular motion while Haggard fought to stay upright. With each shift, Haggard centered his balance against the oncoming movement. He felt the wind move across his feathers. He lifted his wings slightly and at times tested the currents. He moved with them, breathed with them, but then they stopped. He held his breath and tried to cower, but betrayed himself. He was caught up in excitement. He tried to hide it, but it swelled up from inside. He opened up breathlessly, fighting his wind, first raising his beak slowly up and out, and then his wings followed. They stretched into the air, out as far and as high as they would go. He then breathed slowly in and back out. "I think you want it," Warren whispered. "You just don't know how much." He opened his eyes. It couldn't have been no more than an instant, but now a mountain range raced forward. He pulled back on the stick, felt his weight shift, and checked the monitor. Only 7 more minutes. Goliath could kill him after that. It didn't matter. He leveled off and watched rain splatter against the windshield. Rain fell outside as a chill edged its way into his bones. He wanted to hear the sound of footsteps, he wanted the hood removed, and he wanted to fly. The cold lingered while the air warmed. It It stayed in his hollow bones and clung to his hunger. He moved around his perch, searching for warmth. There was none. "Look at you," Warren said. "You're sick." Haggard felt the boy's breast strike his feathers and thought he could feel the boy's eyes studying him. "You've given up. You were the best I've ever seen, fast and silent, and now you're dying." "Stay awake," he told himself. "You've got to stay awake." Haggard watched the sun break through the mist and wondered what he was carrying. But that was a frightening thought. The bombs were heavy. They were so heavy that he couldn't do vertical takeoff. It was just the wrong plane for the job. So when he took off, he had to rely on a portion of the cratered runway. Solo with two heavyweights. It had to be a suicide run. He knew he wouldn't see his wife or his son again, and there was no way out. He put his eyes on the instruments, corrected his drift, and looked upon the long, unfamiliar roads, and still didn't understand why they hadn't seen him. The world was as crazy as his dream, and he wanted that dream back, to hear the voice of his son again, but he could only hear the roar of the engine. He flew on. He might sound cruel, but he's not. That was Warren's voice. Haggard shook his head and tapped his helmet. Warren had said that about him before. He then smelled a piece of fresh meat, reached out, and took it. The meat was wet and warm. It made him hungrier. Dad just never knew what parts to cut up first. He took care of his birds, but I don't think he ever watched them beyond the hunt. Haggard reached out and found a larger piece. He dropped it onto the glove, put his talon on it, and ripped at the flesh between his toes. "You are hungry. I wonder what made you change your mind. Do you want to live now? Is that it?" Haggard stopped eating and looked up at the boy's face, as if he could see it. "Oh God, I'm in trouble," he thought. He clenched his eyes shut. "Am I going crazy not to face this?" He opened his eyes. Clouds raced over the glass. Was it a dream? He checked his bearing and his fuel level and watched the small X on the monitor approach its destination. Would his son understand? He struggled with the straps on his helmet and then pulled it off. The air was cold and crisp. He loved the feeling, but something had changed. He looked from one feathered wing across the horizon to the other. Part of the sun was buried below the earth. Its glow was reflected across streams and lakes. Bells were tied to his legs. They were heavy. He couldn't fly far or fast. He then spotted Warren coming up the path, dived to his hand, fanned himself to a standstill, and gently touched down. "I don't think Dad would have believed it," Warren said. He slowly shook his head and looked down while he walked. "You're strong." The muscles in his face tightened. He closed his eyes and clenched his teeth. "We're both strong now. He stopped talking. Tears filled his eyes, but he forced them back and took a breath. "He's dead. Dad's dead. I wish he would have killed them all." Haggard stopped cold and stared up at his son. Tears slipped from Warren's eyes and onto his cheeks. "Why?" Haggard couldn't move. He tried, but he just couldn't move. Sweat then dropped into his eyes. He pulled his head up and watched the world glide by, while half of him remembered his dream. Tears ran down his cheeks as he felt the pain that he just couldn't wipe away. Goliath still hadn't spotted him. He had made it this far without being detected, but he was losing against himself. He was giving up. All he had to do was reach his destination and drop, and if he did, would his country claim that he acted on his own? Would his family be ashamed? He stopped fighting and lowered his head and closed his eyes. The ground moved off in the distance to become horizon. The horizon merged with the sky. The sun crept into view and moved across the center. Haggard flew near the forest and then entered it. He dodged branches and leaves, flew almost straight up, and broke into a valley of treetops. He glided there, free, and then spotted Warren in the meadow. Warren looked confused, frightened. He moved his head back and forth, searching for something. Haggard flew forward. A glint of light hit his eye. It moved out, exposing a shaft, a tip of a hand, and part of a bow. Haggard then heard the jet's warning. Enough! It was a dream. He knew it. He had to fight his way out to save himself, but the dream froze him. It was important. He held his breath for a moment, let his anger and his fear build, and then pushed his wings, flapped hard, harder than he had before. The ground raced in a blur below him. His breath pounded with his flight. It was too fast, too hard, but the hand was in front, moving slowly out. It quivered from the weight of the bow. He closed his eyes as he skimmed the top of a bush and opened them in despair as he looked up at the size of the hand. He was small, too small to fight. He pulled out of the dive, tried to slow down. There was nothing he could do, but he was moving too fast. He watched the shaft and the string and tried to fly around it. Tried to circle without injury, but he forgot about the man. Haggard looked into the face in horror, extended his talons, and slammed into the eyes. Haggard jumped at the sound of the buzzer. A warning. He pulled back on the stick, stopped his descent, and checked the clock. The sound of the buzzer then changed. It was a lock-on. Damn, he said, almost laughing. Here, I have your ass. Identify yourself. Haggard did laugh. Goliath had him, and he was dead. Shit, he said, if he could just get there. Harrier, if you don't reply, I'm gonna blow you out of the air. Do it, Haggard thought. He then reached for the radio button. Say anything. I have information. Shoot me down or guide me in. He had to follow his orders. Less than a minute. He edged into the air on his wings and saw his son lying in his back with the arrow in his chest. He dropped onto the boy's chest and looked up at the shaft while his son took a slow breath. You got it, Warren said. His eyebrows narrowed and his forced smile disappeared. I wish I could. He took a long breath. It hurts. He reached up for the shaft. Tremor shook his body. He moaned, let go of the arrow, and gasped for air. Haggard, he finally said. He pulled at the leather straps on Haggard's ankles. He took a quick breath and then coughed. Dad, don't do this. Warren dropped the straps, and Haggard was free. Free. That was a dream. He watched the nose of the bird on his right and listened to the warning buzzer from the one behind, and then realized that he'd reached his target. He thumbed the safety open and slipped his finger over the button. I'm free, he said, and knew he wasn't. He closed his eyes for a moment and then drifted. Do it, he thought. No. He couldn't arm the bombs or drop them, and he was losing altitude. He stopped fighting and let sleep take him. Haggard tasted cold, sharp metal while his mouth was dry and empty. He felt his head tied, bound in a heavy casing that blocked his eyes. He was hungry, thirsty, straining to hear the footsteps as they neared him. He was cold, alone, and he'd lost his wings. The door creaked open, and he knew he was still alive. Why? He lifted his head. Pain. He listened to his own breath ring in his ears. He had lost everything except for his life. Why didn't he drop the bombs? Why? And where were the dreams now? The pain was slipping away, and someone was in the room. Is there anything you want to say? Silence. The man touched his arm. Did you hear it was over? At what cost, Haggard wondered. He hadn't followed his orders. It had stopped their retaliation, but not their invasion, their police action. Did his family survive? The bed began to spin, and Haggard felt his weakness overtake him. Again. He let it happen. He drifted with it, let go of his wife and son, and then began to fly. He was free.